In a previous video, we've created this Bootstrap autoload and made use of the container, which we haven't created yet. Now, the container, IOC container in any serious application, it's quite a complex component. Our container is going to be really very simple. We don't need any dependency injection here, which would indicate obviously if you need any component instantiated, and this component basically requires some sort of dependencies to be passed through through the constructor. Then you could do it this way and then just call a given instance from the container from any part of your application, obviously simplifying things quite a lot because you wouldn't have to instantiate it with all these dependencies every time you want to use it. But as I said earlier, our container is going to be really very simple. It's going to be a simple binding of these two things only for this exercise to one property and then retrieving them whenever we need them. So the first thing we're going to do is to create a test. So we go into the test unit and we create the new class called container test. And it needs to extend test case. There we go. And now the first method will be the first test, basically. In the first test, we want to check whether we are able to bind a single item, a single class, basically instantiate the object and associate it with a given index that we're going to give it. So let's start with a public function and call it bind single item. And again, let's indicate that it's a test. And the first thing I'm going to do is to use the container, which again, we haven't got this class yet, and then use the bind method on this container and pass the first argument will be the name that I want to use in order to later on to be able to retrieve it by. And in this case, it's going to be date. And the object I want to associate with it, it's going to be instance of new date time. We don't need brackets because we're not passing any arguments here. And then we are doing assertion, this assert instance of date time class. And we're looking for container, and there will be method get, and we're going to get date. And let's put it all on new lines here as well. And then message, if it's not an instance of date time class, the message will be container bind did not bind single item. Okay, if we run our test back to the terminal, PHP unit, and obviously we get error class container not found. So let's quickly go to our app directory, and right under this app directory, let's create a new class called container. And the namespace will be app. Hit return, there we go. So here's our new container class. And this class will have a private static property called container, which will simply be an array. The next thing we are using, if we go back to this test, we're using bind and get. So let's start with the bind method. I'm going to start with the public static function bind. It will take two arguments. Key is the first one, and the value is the second one, by default null. And by default null because I want to allow this method for the first argument to be either a single item with the value or an array of the items with the associated values. That's why we have null for default value, because we may pass the array which will have keys and values within it. So the first thing we are going to do is to check if an exclamation mark is array, and we're checking, no, it's is array, there we go, and we're passing for the key as an argument. So if it's not an array, then we simply do key equals, and we go for key equals value. So basically converting this key to an array by taking a key argument and a value. And then what we are going to do is call static bind array, and we pass this key through. So at this point, we know that this key is definitely an array. So if it's not to start with, if it's just a single value, then we are converting it to an array, basically passing key as the key and a value as the value of this array. And then we pass this to this bind array. Obviously, bind array method does not exist, so let's quickly create this method. And the first thing we are going to do, let's rename the argument. First of all, it's going to be of the array type, and let's call it simply array. Inside of this method, what we are going to do is simply use static container, and we override it using array underscore merge, passing the static container as the first argument, and then our array. So basically, what is happening here? This array merge will take the first array and the second array, and then whatever is inside of the first array and also within the second array will be overwritten with the values from the second array. So if we have one index within a container and the same index exists within the array that we're actually passing through, then the one that is already in a container will be overwritten with a new one. And then obviously we associate the result because array merge returns the result basically as an array, and we're associating this with the container, so we have a fresh new container with this. Okay, so that's it. Obviously, if you want to read more about array merge, go to php.net, type in array underscore merge in a search, and then you're gonna see the whole specification. Okay, let's scroll down a little bit, a few more lines. The next method that we are interested in is called get. So public static function get. The argument will be the key. And first we check if this key actually exists on the container. So if exclamation mark array key exists, key on the static container, we're checking if it doesn't exist, and if it doesn't exist, let's throw the exception. So throw new exception, just a standard one, and the exception will say there is no key bound on the container or in the container. There we go. Let's import this exception as well. So that's all at the top here. And then after this, we know that obviously the key has been found, so the item is within the container, so we simply return it. Static container with the key that will give us the value, which is basically going to be the instance of the object that we are after. Okay, let's create doc blocks for all these items, and then for the bind method, bind to the container, bind a single item. Actually no, because we can pass actually array of items whereas the first argument. So let's keep it like this: bind the container, and here bind array to the container, and then we have get item from the container. There we go. Okay, let's go to the terminal. So PHP unit, and we still get the error because we haven't actually imported this class. So let's go back to our container test, and let's use app container. And now if we go back and run the same test, and we have 12 tests, 20 assertions, all of which pass. So our test is now passing, which means our bind method works fine with a single item when we're passing key and value. Let's now create the second test, which checks for multiple items for the array, for this other scenario. I'm going to copy basically duplicate this entire first test, and I'm going to rename this binds multiple items. And this time, rather than having, I'm just going to cut all this, and I'm going to replace it with the array, paste it in. So first one will be date as date and time, and the other one will be directory as new directory iterator, and I'm going to pass current directory as an argument to this to the constructor of this class. Okay, and then we're going to check again for the same thing, but this time we're going to change the message. Container bind did not bind multiple items, and in brackets let's indicate that we're talking about date in this instance, and let's copy this entire thing, paste it underneath. And this time we're checking for this other one, which is directory iterator, and we looking for the index directory when we retrieve item from this container by directory. And if that fails, we want to indicate that it's the directory that failed. Okay, let's save it, go back to the terminal and test it. And everything seems to be working fine. So our container is working fine. So whether we pass a single item as key and value or only a single argument as an array of items indexes with the associated instances of the objects, it's all working fine. So that's exactly what we wanted. Now let's go back to our Bootstrap autoload, and we need to import this container. So let's quickly import this class app container right at the top, but after the autoload, because we want this to be, we want to be able to basically autoload it. Same for the .env. Let's actually import all these classes that we are using here, so everything is in one place rather than using the full path. Okay, this Illuminate HTTP request, let's put them separately because these are separate packages, and these are our internal components, so let's keep them separate. And I think that's everything. We can now open our window browser and try to run the setup.php file. When we open our setup.php file, you can see that we get this exception. This time, this exception indicates that we simply don't have books database on our MySQL database. So let's go back to our editor, have a look at our env file. I've indicated that I want to use MySQL. It's a local host, port 3306. Database name is books, and I'm using Homestead, so Homestead and secret for username and password. So what I'm going to do is to open SQL Pro, which is what I'm using to connect to the databases on Homestead, my Homestead installation here, and I'm just going to log in. Secret, there we go, and I'm going to quickly create the new database. If you're using MAMP, WAMP, or XAMPP, please use the tools that you probably have access to phpMyAdmin. Create a new database called books, and that should do the trick. So our database name is books, and then I want encoding to be set to UTF-8. Click on add, and our books table is now created. If we go back to the browser, now refresh, and there we go, we get project setup. And select one of the options. We don't want to reset because we haven't migrated yet. So let's click on the migrate button, and there we go. It tells us database tables have been created, and you can go to the home page. We obviously still see just a template because we haven't coded this page yet. But let's go back to the database, and if I refresh now, you'll see all of the tables have been automatically created for us. The same will happen if I was to use SQLite. So if you don't want to use MySQL, use SQLite. And if we go back to the setup, let's remove this, just a setup.php, but let's go back to our .env file and just set it to SQLite. We can leave these things for now. Let's just close out these directories here. And what I'm going to do is use terminal, go terminal, to the terminal, and I'm going to, within the root of our directory, I'm just going to quickly create the database file. I'm going to simply use touch and call it books.SQLite. Hit return. That will create the file here. As you can see, books SQLite. Let's actually add this SQLite extension to it as well here. So now SQLite will only take basically the database name because we don't have the concept of username and password within SQLite. So let's go back to our browser, and if we migrate now, refresh the page, and there we go. The database tables have been created. So what I'm going to do now in order to check if they actually have been created, from within the terminal, I'm going to call SQLite 3, or I can call also just SQLite because I've got it symlinked to SQLite 3, but let's stick to SQLite 3 because you may not have any symlink done to this SQLite installation. If you haven't got SQLite installed on your machine, please check our setup local environment when I'm explaining how to do it all. Okay, SQLite 3, and then the name of the database, which in our case is this file books.SQLite. Hit return, and now what I want to do is check what sort of tables I have on this database. So I'm going to start with a full stop, tables, hit return, and there we go. All these tables that we had inside of the MySQL database, we also have here. So the migration has been successful. If I now go back and hit on reset, and now go back to the terminal, and if I run the same command, so full stop tables, you can see we don't see any tables because they all have been removed. So you can either migrate or reset your database. If I hit on migrate again, back to the terminal, run the command, and tables are back in. Now I'm going to exit SQLite, so full stop quit, clear the command line, and let's go back to our editor. Now I won't be using SQLite, I actually will use MySQL, so I'm just going to reverse it back to what it was. But if you don't want to use MySQL, you obviously have this choice of SQLite. The database file is going to be wherever you're going to put it. Obviously just make sure that database, this db_database points to this file. Okay, I think we are done with this video. Let's move to the next one.